found out my parents left everything to my brother. So I stopped paying their bills. I always thought I was a good son. The responsible one. The one who never caused trouble. While my younger brother, Tom, drifted through life with no real job, no real goals, and no real responsibilities, I worked hard. Paid my own way through college, built a career, and, out of a sense of duty, helped my parents financially whenever they needed it. It wasn't a question. If they were short on mortgage payments, I covered it. When the roof needed fixing, I paid for it. When their medical bills stacked up, I took care of them. Tom. He never lifted a finger. But my parents had always favored him. The golden child. The one who could do no wrong, no matter how much he screwed up. I thought I had accepted it, until last Thanksgiving. We were sitting around the dinner table at my parents' house, the same one I had spent years helping them keep afloat, when my father, after a few too many glasses of wine, let something slip. "Oh, and we finalized the will last month," he said casually, stabbing a piece of turkey. "Got everything squared away. The house, the accounts, all of it." I nodded, not thinking much of it at first. But then my mother added with a smile, "At least we know Tom will have a secure future." I froze. "Tom?" I repeated, my fork pausing midair. They exchanged a glance, clearly not expecting me to catch on so quickly. "Well, yes," my mother said. "We decided to leave everything to him. It just makes sense. He's the one who needs it the most." I stared at them, trying to process what I had just heard. I had been the one supporting them. I had been the one keeping their heads above water. And yet, in the end, they had left me nothing. Not a dime. I looked at my brother, who smirked like he had won some invisible game. He didn't even try to act surprised. He already knew. That was the moment something inside me snapped. But I didn't react. I didn't ask why. I didn't argue. I didn't make a scene. I simply nodded, swallowed my anger, and finished my meal in silence. I think that unnerved them more than anything else. I could feel my mother's eyes on me, waiting for me to protest. My father shifted in his chair as if expecting some kind of backlash. But I gave them nothing. Because at that moment, I realized something. It didn't matter. They had made their choice. They had shown me exactly where I stood in this family. And now? I was making my own choice. The next morning, I woke up with absolute clarity. I wasn't going to fight with them. I wasn't going to beg or demand fairness. I was done. For years, I had been their financial safety net. Every unexpected expense, every emergency, they came to me. And I paid, because that's what a good son does, right? But now, they had made it clear, I wasn't their priority. I was just their backup plan. Not anymore. Step 1. Cut off all financial support. The first thing I did was cancel the automatic payments I had set up for their mortgage, utilities, and insurance. It wasn't my house. It wasn't my future. Why was I paying for it? Then, I stopped covering their extra expenses. The credit card they used for emergencies? Cancelled. The monthly allowance I had been sending? Gone. And finally, I made sure Tom knew. I sent him a simple text. "Mom and Dad left you everything. So from now on, you're taking care of them. Their bills, their mortgage, their expenses, that's all yours now. Best of luck." I knew exactly what was going to happen next. First, they'd ignore it. Pretend it wasn't real. Then, when the bills started piling up, my mother would call, acting like nothing had happened. I was right. 3 weeks later, I got the first message. From Mom. "The mortgage is due." No greeting. No small talk. Just a demand. I stared at the screen for a long time. And then, with the same cold detachment they had shown me, I replied. "Not my problem. Talk to your heir." Silence. I put my phone down and went about my day. For the first time in my life, I felt free. But something told me this was just the beginning. The silence didn't last long. My mother had always been the type who avoided direct confrontation but thrived on guilt-tripping. At first, she ignored my response, likely assuming I was just acting out. She probably thought that once I cooled down, I would come crawling back, apologizing for my selfishness. A week passed. Then two. The call started with my father. He tried a different tactic, calm, measured, almost as if he was reasoning with a business partner rather than his own son. He listed out the bills, the overdue notices, the growing pressure. He spoke about the sacrifices they had made raising me, the roof they had provided, the food, the opportunities. It was all carefully framed to make me feel like I owed them something. But I had already done more than enough. For years, I had been the one holding up their financial stability. My brother had never been expected to contribute, never asked to step up. I was the one who made sure they never struggled. And yet, when it came time to secure their future, they didn't even consider me. They didn't even give me a fraction of what I had already given them. I let my father talk, let him lay out every reason why I should do the right thing. When he finished, I simply told him that my decision was final. I wouldn't be paying another cent. Then I hung up. That's when my mother took over. She was never direct. She wouldn't outright ask for money or acknowledge what they had done. Instead, she turned to social media, carefully crafting a narrative that made it look like they had been abandoned. Posts about how painful it is when family turns their back on you, about raising a child with love, only for them to forget you when you need them most. Not once did she mention why I had pulled away, only that I had. And then there was my brother. Tom was the only one who had remained completely silent through all of this, at least at first. I assumed he was comfortable with his newfound position as the sole heir. But then, reality must have started to sink in. Suddenly, the financial burden wasn't something abstract anymore. The bills were real. The mortgage was real. The money wasn't magically appearing in their accounts each month, and he was now the one responsible. The first time he reached out, it was almost amusing. His tone was casual, as if we were just two brothers catching up. He brought up childhood memories, random things we hadn't talked about in years, almost like he was trying to build a bridge before getting to the real reason for the conversation. It didn't take long for him to crack. He tried to argue that I was being unfair, that I was punishing them over something that wasn't really a big deal. He said that wills didn't matter, that our parents had simply made a mistake. That I was blowing everything out of proportion. I didn't reply. The next message was less friendly. He accused me of being selfish, of leaving our parents to suffer just to prove a point. He told me that I was the one with money, that I could afford to help them, that he wasn't in the same position as me. And that was exactly the problem. They had spent years making excuses for him. Allowing him to drift through life, never pushing him to do more, because they always had me as a backup. I was always there, always reliable, always fixing what needed to be fixed. Not anymore. Tom tried a few more times, shifting between anger and guilt, but I had made my decision. I was done. That's when the true desperation started. The bills weren't just overdue anymore, they were critical. The mortgage had been unpaid for months. Notices were stacking up. Without my financial support, my parents were running out of options. Tom wasn't stepping up the way they had expected him to. Or maybe they had known all along that he wouldn't, and had just hoped I would break before they did. I didn't. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. The house, the same house I had spent years paying for, was now in danger of foreclosure. They were scrambling. Panicking. My mother called me, and this time, there was no guilt-tripping, no passive-aggressive attempts at emotional manipulation. There was only begging. Her voice trembled as she told me how bad things had gotten. The house was all they had left, she said. If the bank took it, they wouldn't have anywhere to go. She told me they were sorry for what had happened, that they never meant to make me feel excluded. That they had made a mistake, but that I couldn't just leave them like this. But they had left me out first. They had made a conscious decision to build a future that did not include me. And now, they expected me to save them from the consequences of that decision. I let my mother finish, listened to the quiet desperation in her voice. Then, with the same calm detachment that I had when I first discovered the will, I told her no. She was stunned. Silent. I could hear her struggling to find the words, as if she had never truly considered that I would refuse. But I had made my choice. And I wasn't changing my mind. The silence after my refusal didn't last long. Within a few hours, the texts started rolling in. First from my mother, then my father, and finally, Tom. Each one carried a different tone, a different tactic. My mother, unsurprisingly, leaned into guilt. She told me how heartbroken she was, how she never imagined that her own son would abandon them in their time of need. She talked about all the sacrifices they had made for me, all the nights they had stayed up worrying about my future, and now, when they needed me the most, I had turned my back on them. It was an emotional attack, carefully crafted to make me feel like I was the villain in this story. But I knew the truth. For years, I had been the one making sacrifices. I had been the one worrying about their future. And when it had been time for them to show me even the slightest bit of gratitude, they had cast me aside like an afterthought. So I ignored her. My father's approach was different. He was always the pragmatic one, the one who thought problems could be solved through logic. He didn't try to guilt me, he tried to reason with me. He laid out their financial situation, explained how dire things had become. He talked about how foreclosure worked, how losing the house would be devastating for them at their age. He said that, despite everything, I was still their son, and families should always take care of each other. It was a clever tactic. He was appealing to my sense of responsibility, the same sense of duty that had kept me tethered to them for so many years. But I wasn't playing that role anymore. I left his messages on read. Tom, of course, was the last to reach out. And, as expected, his message was the least eloquent. He didn't try to manipulate or reason with me. He went straight for anger. Dude, you're being a complete asshole. This is Mom and Dad we're talking about. You can't just let them lose everything. I stared at his message for a long time, debating whether to even reply. Then, finally, I sent him a single response. Not my problem. It's yours now. I had expected him to blow up, to send a long-winded rant about how selfish I was, how I was abandoning them. Instead, he just sent back. Wow. You're actually serious. Yes. I was serious. I had spent years being the only responsible one, the only one cleaning up after his mess, covering for our parents' financial mistakes. I was done. Tom must have realized that, too, because for the first time in his life, he had to deal with a situation where I wasn't bailing him out. The weeks that followed were almost surreal. At first, my parents tried to pretend that things weren't as bad as they were. They must have convinced themselves that I was bluffing, that eventually, I would cave and come crawling back, checkbook in hand, ready to fix everything. But I didn't. I watched from a distance as reality set in. The first cracks started with small things, services getting shut off, their internet and cable going out, notices stacking up in their mailbox. I heard from an old family friend that my mother had been borrowing money from some of her friends, something she had never done before. My father, once proud and controlled, had started looking exhausted and worn down. Then came the ultimate sign of desperation. They put the house up for sale. When I saw the listing online, I actually laughed. The same house I had spent years helping them pay for, the house they had taken for granted, was now something they couldn't even afford to keep. And Tom? He wasn't stepping up. It turned out that the golden child, the one they had trusted with everything, was just as unreliable as ever. I wasn't sure if he had even tried to help, but I knew one thing for certain: he didn't have the resources I did. He didn't have the savings, the stability, or the means to fix the problem. So he did what he always did when things got tough. He disappeared. I heard through mutual friends that Tom had been avoiding our parents' calls, dodging their messages, ignoring their pleas for help. He had no problem accepting everything they had to give him, but when it came time to return the favor, he vanished. I knew this was coming. I had known at the moment my father had let it slip that the will left everything to him. I had seen it for years, how they coddled him, how they excused his laziness, how they put him on a pedestal while treating me like a resource instead of a son. And now, they were paying the price for their blind devotion. The foreclosure process moved quickly. Within 2 months, the house was officially out of their hands. I never asked where they went next. I assumed they either moved into a rental or were staying with family. And then, out of nowhere, I got another message from my mother. It was different this time. Not guilt, not anger. It was pure, raw desperation. "We don't have anywhere to go. Please, Jake, don't do this. We're still your parents." I stared at the message for a long time, thinking about everything. All the times they had overlooked me. All the money I had given them, never expecting anything in return. All the sacrifices I had made, only to be left with nothing. They had made their choice. Now they had to live with it. I took a deep breath and typed my final response. "I'm sure Tom will figure something out." Then, without hesitation, I blocked their numbers. And for the first time in my life, I was truly free. Blocking their numbers should have felt like the final act, the ultimate closing of the door. But life rarely wraps things up that cleanly. Even though I had shut them out, I still felt their presence lingering in the background. Old family friends, distant relatives, and even some of my parents' neighbors started reaching out, their messages laced with concern, judgment, or outright anger. Some took the guilt-tripping route, asking me how I could abandon my own parents in their time of need. Others were more aggressive, accusing me of being heartless, of letting my family suffer while I lived in comfort. None of them knew the full story. None of them knew about the years I had spent carrying my parents financially, of how I had put my own needs second to make sure they were comfortable. None of them knew about the will. My parents hadn't told anyone about that part, of course. They had painted themselves as the victims of an ungrateful son, conveniently leaving out the part where they had written me out of their future entirely. I ignored every message, every call. But then, something happened that I hadn't anticipated. Tom reached out again. I hadn't heard from him in weeks, not since I had shut him down the first time. But this time, he wasn't angry. He wasn't trying to guilt me. He was scared. His message was simple. "I screwed up." That was all he wrote. No demands, no insults. Just those 3 words. At first, I considered ignoring him. But my curiosity got the better of me. So I replied. What happened? What followed was a confession that, frankly, I had seen coming a mile away. After our parents lost the house, Tom had tried to help them financially, but it hadn't lasted long. The truth was, he had never actually managed money before. He had always lived off of whatever was given to him, never having to budget, never having to think long-term. So when it became his responsibility to take care of everything, he panicked. He had burned through whatever savings he had left trying to cover their rent, their food, their medical bills. He had even taken out loans he now couldn't repay. And now? He was drowning. He wasn't just broke. He was in debt. Serious debt. And my parents? They were furious with him. The golden child had failed them. I could almost picture it. The tension, the disappointment. My parents realizing, too late, that they had placed their future in the hands of someone who had never been capable of handling it. I wondered how that conversation had gone. Had they yelled at him? Had they begged him to do better? Had they finally understood what they had done? I doubted it. People like them rarely acknowledged their mistakes. Tom kept messaging me, throwing out desperate attempts to get me to engage. He admitted that our parents were looking at homeless shelters as a possibility, that he was running out of options, that he didn't know what to do. And then, the final message came. I know you're mad. But they're still our parents. I stared at my phone for a long time. Yes. They were still our parents. But they had made their choice. They had chosen to prioritize Tom. They had chosen to leave me out of their future. And now, that future had arrived, and it wasn't my responsibility to fix it. So I typed out my last response. Not my problem. And this time, I meant it. I blocked Tom, just like I had blocked our parents. And for the first time in my life, I truly walked away. The weeks that followed were eerily quiet. No more calls. No more texts. No more people reaching out on my parents' behalf. They had finally understood that I wasn't coming back. And surprisingly, life got better. Without the weight of their constant financial burdens, I found myself with more freedom than I had ever had before. I traveled. I spent time with friends. I invested in myself in ways I had never been able to while I was constantly throwing money into a bottomless pit labeled family obligations. I expected to feel guilt. I expected to feel regret. But I didn't. Because for the first time in my life, I had chosen myself. And I had no intention of ever looking back. For the first time in years, my life felt quiet. Peaceful, even. I had no lingering stress about unpaid bills that weren't mine to begin with, no unexpected calls demanding I send money, no last-minute emergencies that always, somehow, required me to step in. The silence was strange at first. I had been so conditioned to living under the weight of obligation that it took me a while to truly understand what it meant to be free. Then, news of my parents finally reached me. Not through them, of course. I had blocked every possible form of contact they had. But one afternoon, while I was out grabbing coffee, I ran into an old family friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. She recognized me immediately, stopping me with an overly familiar smile. Oh my God, Jake. It's been so long. How have you been? I gave the polite, distant kind of answer you give to people you barely know but don't want to offend. I've been good. Keeping busy. Then, I saw the shift in her expression. A hint of something just beneath the surface. Pity. She wasn't here to make small talk. She was here because she knew. I heard about your parents, she said, lowering her voice as if she was sharing some tragic, whispered secret. I just wanted to say. I'm so sorry for everything they're going through. I sipped my coffee, keeping my face neutral. What exactly are they going through? I asked. The moment the words left my mouth, I could tell she wasn't expecting that response. I assumed you knew. I figured someone would have told you by now. She hesitated, then continued, her voice carefully measured. After they lost the house, things got really bad for them. They've been struggling just to get by. And Tom, well, you know how Tom is. I did. And I had a pretty good guess as to what struggling meant. They're living in a small apartment now, she went on. Nothing like what they had before. I don't think they can even afford groceries some weeks. And Tom, she trailed off, shaking her head. I think he's in over his head. Of course he was. This was exactly what I had expected to happen. Tom had spent his entire life being coddled, having everything handed to him, never being held accountable. Now that he was finally facing real responsibility, he was crumbling under it. And my parents? They were finally experiencing what it felt like to be dependent on someone who wasn't dependable. For years, they had put all their faith in Tom. They had treated him like he was their future. And now, he was proving, just like he always had, that he was nothing more than an empty promise. I just thought you should know, she said gently. I finished my coffee, nodded, and simply replied, thanks for telling me. Then, I walked away. I didn't reach out. I didn't unblock their numbers. I didn't suddenly feel the need to fix everything. I thought I might, for a moment. I thought maybe I would feel that old pull, that nagging sense of guilt that had been ingrained in me since childhood. But I didn't. Because I knew something they didn't. This wasn't my failure. This wasn't something I had caused. It wasn't something I had done to them. They had done this to themselves. For years, they had relied on me, not because I was their only option, but because I was the most convenient option. They had taken me for granted. They had never prepared for the possibility that I might say no. And when I finally did, everything collapsed. Not because I was cruel. Not because I was selfish. But because they had built a life that only functioned as long as I was there to support it. And now, they were learning the hard way that I wasn't coming back. Months passed. I kept waiting for the next wave of guilt, for the next attempt to pull me back in. But it never came. It was almost as if they had finally given up. And I felt lighter than I ever had before. Months passed in silence. The kind of silence that I had once feared but now embraced. For the first time in my adult life, I was living for myself. No more worrying about unpaid bills that weren't mine, no more feeling obligated to solve problems I hadn't created, no more sleepless nights wondering if I was doing enough for people who had never done enough for me. I expected my parents to keep trying. To keep reaching out. To keep attempting to manipulate me. To keep pushing the same guilt they had always relied on. But they didn't. They had finally realized that I wasn't breaking this time. And honestly, that should have been the end of it. But then, one evening, just as I was settling into the comfortable rhythm of my new life, it happened. They showed up at my door. It was late. I had just gotten home from work when I heard the knock. It wasn't tentative. It wasn't polite. It was insistent. I knew before I even looked through the peephole who it was. And sure enough, there they were. My mother. My father. And Tom, standing slightly behind them, arms crossed like some defiant child. I didn't open the door right away. I just stood there, staring at them through the glass, waiting to see if they would leave. They didn't. So, finally, I exhaled, unlatched the door, and stepped outside. My mother wasted no time. "Jake," she started, her voice raw, "we need to talk." I didn't invite them in. "What is there to talk about?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. My father ran a hand down his face, looking more exhausted than I had ever seen him. "You know how bad things have gotten. We just need." "No," I cut in. "You don't just need. You need everything. You need a bailout. You need someone to clean up this mess. And since Tom clearly isn't doing it, you came here. To me." Tom scoffed, shifting uncomfortably. "Don't be a dick about it, man." I turned to him. "You mean don't tell the truth? Because that's exactly what this is. You all made your choices, and now you're dealing with the consequences." Tom looked away, but my mother wasn't ready to give up. "We made a mistake," she said softly. "We thought we were doing the right thing, but we see now that she swallowed hard. We hurt you." I stared at her for a long moment. Was this real? Had they actually learned something? Had they finally, after all this time, realized what they had done? Then she took a step forward, lowering her voice. "But Jake, we're still family." And just like that, I knew. This wasn't remorse. It was desperation. They hadn't come here because they regretted what they had done. They had come here because they had no other options left. They had lost the house. They had burned through every favor, every borrowed dollar. Tom had failed them. And now, they were testing the last lifeline they had left. Me. I shook my head slowly, exhaling. "You still don't get it." My mother's face tightened. "Get what?" I gestured between them, between all three of them. "You don't want to fix this. You don't want to make things right. You just want me to go back to how I was before. The son who never said no. The one who kept paying and paying, no matter how unfair it was. My father opened his mouth, but I didn't let him speak. You had a plan for the future. And I wasn't in it. I let the words sink in. You made that decision. You put everything on him instead. I turned my gaze to Tom, who suddenly looked much smaller than he had before. You gambled on the wrong son. Silence. No one spoke. No one moved. Then, finally, my mother let out a choked breath, her eyes pleading. Jake, please. But there was nothing left to say. I stepped back toward my door, gripping the handle. I don't owe you anything, I said. Not anymore. And with that, I shut the door. They didn't knock again. They just stood there for a few minutes. And then, they left. And this time, I knew they weren't coming back. After they left, I stood in silence, staring at the closed door, listening to their footsteps fade down the hall. I expected to feel something, guilt, anger, regret, but all I felt was relief. Not the hesitant kind. Not the type where you second-guess yourself minutes later. The real kind. The kind that settles deep in your bones, letting you know you've finally made the right decision. For the first time in my life, I had chosen myself. And I wasn't looking back. The days passed quietly. No more texts. No more calls. No more social media posts painting me as the villain. They had finally accepted the truth. I wasn't going to save them. And honestly, they were never really looking for a solution. They weren't here to repair the damage. They weren't here to take accountability. They were here because they thought they could guilt me back into being their crutch. And when that didn't work, they disappeared. I heard little things through mutual acquaintances. That they had downsized to an even smaller place. That Tom had stopped returning their calls. That my mother had been trying to reconnect with distant relatives, likely searching for another safety net. But that wasn't my concern anymore. It never should have been. I wasn't the villain in this story. I wasn't abandoning them. I was simply refusing to be used. And that was the most liberating realization of my life. Then, one afternoon, I got an email. It wasn't from my parents. It was from their lawyer. For a moment, I considered deleting it. Ignoring it. But something in me told me to read it. So I did. And what I saw nearly made me laugh. It was a revised copy of their will. They had changed it. The house was gone now, obviously. Their finances were in ruins. But whatever was left, they had split it evenly between me and Tom. There was no message attached. No apology. No explanation. Just a cold, impersonal legal document. It wasn't an act of kindness. It wasn't them making amends. It was a last-ditch effort. A final, desperate attempt to leave the door open, just in case. I closed the email. Then I archived it. And just like that, I moved on. For good. Closing that email felt like closing the last remaining door to my past. I didn't reply. I didn't acknowledge it. I didn't even tell anyone about it. Because I had already made my choice. For years, I had been tangled in their expectations, their manipulations, their endless needs. But now, I was free. And it was time to start living like it. At first, I didn't know what to do with my newfound freedom. I had spent so long pouring my time, energy, and money into keeping them afloat that I had never truly lived for myself. So I started small. I finally took that trip I had always put off. I went out more, spent time with people who actually valued me. I picked up hobbies I had abandoned, things I used to love before my life had been consumed by responsibility. And most importantly, I started saving. For myself. For the first time ever, my paycheck was mine. Not a bandage for someone else's mistakes. Not a bottomless fund for a family that only saw me as a resource. Mine. And it felt damn good. Months passed, and life moved on. There was no dramatic reunion. No sudden apology. No grand realization from my parents. They had made their choices. And I had made mine. But one day, out of nowhere, I got a text. From Tom. Hey. That was it. Just one word. No apology. No context. I stared at it for a long time before deciding to reply. What do you want? A few minutes later, 3 dots appeared. Then disappeared. Then reappeared. Finally, his message came through. Guess you were right. It wasn't much. But it was enough. Because deep down, I knew what he was really saying. He wasn't just admitting that he had failed. He was admitting that I had never been the problem. They were. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Because I had finally left it all behind. And this time, I wasn't looking back. I never responded to Tom's message. Not because I was angry. Not because I wanted revenge. But because it didn't matter anymore. His admission, guess you were right, wasn't some heartfelt apology. It wasn't a true moment of self-awareness. It was just another loose thread. Another way to pull me back in. But I had cut those threads. And I wasn't about to start stitching them back together. More time passed. My parents stayed silent. I had expected them to reach out again, some final desperate attempt to mend things, to make me feel guilty. But they didn't. I guess, on some level, they finally understood. They had spent years treating me like an afterthought. They had built a future that did not include me. And now, they were stuck living in the future they had created. Without me. That wasn't my fault. That wasn't my burden. That was just reality. One evening, I sat on my balcony, sipping a drink, watching the city lights flicker below. I thought about everything that had happened, the years of sacrifice, the betrayal, the fallout, the finality of it all. I thought about the younger version of myself. The one who had always tried to do the right thing. The one who had always put family first, no matter what it cost him. The one who had thought that if he just gave enough, they would finally appreciate him. That version of me was gone. Not bitter. Not broken. Just free. And I had no regrets. For the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. And I wouldn't change a thing. The final realization didn't come all at once. It wasn't some grand epiphany or dramatic moment of clarity. It was just peace. A quiet, steady kind of peace that settled into my life the moment I stopped waiting for them to change. Because the truth was, they never would. And that was okay. I never heard from my parents again. Not directly, at least. Every now and then, I'd hear rumors, that they were still struggling, that Tom had all but vanished, that they were burning through what little they had left. But those were just whispers from another life. A life I was no longer part of. And honestly, I didn't miss it. I didn't miss the guilt. I didn't miss the obligation. I didn't miss the endless cycle of giving and giving, only to be discarded when I was no longer useful. I had built something better. A life of my own. And it was worth more than anything they had ever taken from me. One evening, while scrolling through my phone, I came across an old family photo. It was from years ago, back when I still believed that if I just worked hard enough, loved them enough, sacrificed enough, they would finally see me the way I had always seen them. I stared at the picture for a long time. Then, without a second thought, I deleted it. Because some things aren't worth holding on to. And some stories don't need a happy ending. Sometimes, the best ending is just moving on. And that's exactly what I did.